know it is crazy, but I have to confess, I never believed a dog could impact my life the way Buddy did. It started out like any other night, or at least that's how it seemed to go. But there was something different beneath the surface, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. My best friend Ethan had come over just like he always did. We were practically brothers, and Max, my golden retriever, adored him as much as he did me. The three of us had always been inseparable, a type of trio that just connected. But that night everything shifted in ways I never expected. That night, though, the atmosphere felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this strange energy hanging between us, almost like a thread stretched too tightly, the sort of feeling that makes you feel like you're on the edge of something. But you don't know what we've been through so much together. But this felt new, unpredictable. Buddha lay between us. His warm, familiar weight pressed against my leg as Ethan and I sat on the living room floor eating takeout and watching some rerun of an old sitcom. We'd been laughing, joking around the way we always did. But then Ethan went quiet, and when I looked over, he was just watching me, not in a bad way, just different, intense. And then he laughed like he was shaking something off, and it went back to normal. For the time being at least, we spent hours talking about everything and nothing, slipping from one topic to the next. There was something comforting about the easy flow of conversation, the way we could talk about our lives, our dreams, even things we'd probably never tell anyone else. It felt like home, even more so than my actual family sometimes. But I noticed that Ethan was quieter than usual, like he had something on his mind, but didn't want to say it. Finally, after what felt like ages, he spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper you ever think about, like if things could be different. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. Different? How like you finally getting a dog as good as Max? I gave Buddy a gentle nudge, and he looked up at me with those big trusting eyes. But Ethan didn't laugh. He just kept looking at me, and there was something there, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. No. I mean between us. He said, his words hanging in the air like, have you ever thought about things changing? I felt a jolt of surprise, a mixture of curiosity and something I couldn't name. We were close, sure, but we'd never had a conversation like this. I didn't even know if he was serious, but there was a part of me that wanted to ask, to find out if he meant what I thought he did. I could feel Buddy shift beside me, his head resting on my leg, grounding me somehow. What do you mean by that? Jake? I asked, my voice quieter now. Ethan looked away, his gaze drifting to Max, who was still sprawled out lazily between us. I don't know. Maybe it's just been too long since things felt normal. You know. I guess. Maybe I'm thinking too much about it. Forget it. He forced a laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to press him further to figure out what he was really trying to say, but something held me back. Maybe fear of hearing something that could change everything. So instead we went back to our usual banter, though the tension lingered, a silent reminder that we'd left something unsaid. After a while, Ethan stood up, stretching. Guess I should probably head out, he said, though he didn't sound like he wanted to leave. Yeah, probably. I replied, not quite meeting his eyes. But before he could go, Buddy trotted over to him, wagging his tail as if he could sense that we weren't quite ready to end the night. Ethan laughed, scratching Buddy behind the ears. You know, sometimes I think he likes me better than he likes you, he joked, a glint of mischief in his eyes, and just like that, the tension melted away, at least for a moment. But as he scratched Max's head, I couldn't help but notice the way his hand lingered, like he was stalling for time. I was about to say something when Buddy suddenly bounded over to me, nudging his head into my lap like he wanted attention from both of us. Ethan laughed a sound that felt almost like relief and dropped down beside me again, like he'd changed his mind about leaving the silence stretched between us comfortable and tense all at once. Buddy lay sprawled across both of us now, his head resting on my knee while his tail thumped against Jake's leg. It felt almost surreal sitting there with him, with Buddy bridging the space between us. And maybe it was the late hour. Or maybe it was the unspoken words lingering in the air. But I found myself feeling something new, something I didn't entirely understand. We ended up sitting there for what felt like hours, saying little, just enjoying each other's company. It was strange, this quiet intimacy that had settled between us, a closeness that didn't need words to exist. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want it to end. Not yet. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. You know, sometimes I wonder what it would be like if we were more than friends. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, and I could feel my heart skip a beat. I looked at him, trying to gauge his expression, but he was staring at Max, his fingers running absent through the fur on his back. Jake. I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. My mind was racing, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and a strange, quiet excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. He looked up, meeting my gaze, and for a moment everything felt still. It was like we were both standing on the edge of something that neither of us could take back once we crossed it. But then he shook his head, laughing softly. Forget it. I didn't mean to make things weird. No, it's okay, I said quickly, my voice a little too eager. It's just I hadn't thought about it like that before, which wasn't entirely true, but I wasn't ready to admit that, not yet. The night wore on, and eventually Ethan did leave, though not without a lingering glance that I couldn't quite decipher. I watched him go, a strange feeling settling over me, a mixture of relief and regret. I'd always valued our friendship, but something had shifted tonight, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. When I finally went to bed, Buddy curled up beside me, his warm body a comforting presence in the darkness. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the night, Jake's words echoing in my head. I didn't know what to make of it, or if it even meant anything at all. But there was a part of me that couldn't help but wonder what might happen if I let myself think about it. If I let myself imagine a world where things were different. But that's the thing about curiosity. Once it starts, it doesn't let go, and as I lay there with Max's soft breathing beside me, I knew that something had changed, even if I couldn't see it yet. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation Ethan and I had shared. It was like something had cracked open, something we'd both been ignoring. There was an edge to everything now, a strange thrill mixed with nervousness. Every text, every call felt different, like there was something we were both pretending not to notice, but couldn't entirely ignore. A few days later, Ethan showed up at my door again. Buttering over, barking happily, his tail wagging like a flag, clearly excited to see Ethan again. It felt like every time Ethan was around, Buddy was too, as if he sensed something between us, or maybe I was just imagining things. "Hey," Ethan said, leaning casually in the doorway, though his eyes betrayed a certain intensity. "Mind if I come in?" "Yeah, of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I opened the door wider and Ethan stepped inside his gaze, briefly meeting mine before drifting away. Buddy trotted between us, looking up at both of us as if expecting something. We settled onto the couch with Buddy jumping up between us, his head resting on my knee. Ethan reached over, scratching behind Max's ears, his fingers brushing briefly against mine. It felt like an electric shock, a sensation so small but so charged that it took me by surprise. I pulled my hand away quickly, laughing awkwardly, but Ethan didn't seem to notice, so he said, breaking the silence, "Have you thought about what I said?" I hesitated, glancing down at Max, who was watching me with those big trusting eyes. "Honestly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Ethan added slowly, a small smile on his lips. "Yeah, me neither." There was a pause, one that stretched on for a little too long, and I felt my heart beating faster, wondering where this was going. Jake's hand lingered on Max's fur, his gaze shifting between me and Buddy as if he were wrestling with something inside. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer. "I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes I feel like Buddy is the only one who really understands me." "You know, yeah." I agreed, glancing at Max. "He's more than just a dog. He's family." Ethan added, his hand still on Max's back. "Exactly. He just gets it, you know, like he knows when we're stressed or when something's bothering us. And sometimes I wonder if he sees what we can't." I laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in it. "I think he knows us better than we know ourselves." Sometimes Ethan looked at me, a knowing look in his eyes. Maybe he does. Maybe he's just waiting for us to figure it out. The tension was nearly unbearable now, a mix of excitement and hesitation, as if we were both standing on the edge of something we didn't quite understand. Booty shifted between us, stretching out and laying his head on my lap, his tail thumping lightly against Jake's leg. "Do you ever feel like things are meant to happen, like there's something guiding us?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to respond, but I felt myself nodding, unable to look away from him. "Yeah, I do." He moved his hand closer, resting it on Max's back again, and for a moment it felt like everything had shifted. There was no going back from this, and we both knew it. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words, and I found myself leaning just a little closer, as if pulled by something beyond my control. Buddy looked up at both of us, his eyes wide and curious, almost like he was waiting for something to happen. It was a strange, surreal moment, as if time had slowed down, leaving just the three of us in this charged, quiet space. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Do you think he'd mind if we?" My breath caught in my throat and I felt my face flush, unsure of what he was suggesting, but feeling the weight of it all the same. "Don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible for a moment. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just us, me, Ethan and Max. Every sound seemed louder. Every movement magnified, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, as if one buddy nudged Jake's hand with his nose, a gentle, insistent push that felt almost intentional. Ethan laughed softly, glancing down at Max. "See, he gets it, he always has." I tried to laugh too, but the sound came out strained, my mind racing with thoughts I could barely keep up with. I looked over at Ethan, trying to read his expression, but he just smiled, that same easy, confident smile. I'd seen her 1,000 times before. Only now it felt different. Now it felt like an invitation. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand on Max's back, close to Jake's, but not quite touching. The space between us felt impossibly small, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Then Ethan leaned a little closer, his hand moving just a fraction of an inch toward mine. My fingers brushed against his just for a moment, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Buddy looked up at us, his eyes bright and curious, as if he could sense the tension building between us. "I think he's okay with it," Ethan said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something raw, something honest in his gaze, and I felt myself drawn to it like a magnet, pulling me closer. And for the first time, I didn't want to fight it. I didn't want to hold back. Buddy lay between us, a silent witness to whatever was unfolding, his presence grounding us, giving us permission to explore something new, something we hadn't even realized was there. We sat there for a long time, the three of us in that quiet, intimate space, not needing words to understand what was happening. It was like we'd stumbled upon something fragile, something sacred, and neither of us wanted to break it. Finally, Ethan leaned back, exhaling a slow, steady breath. "I don't want to mess this up," he said, his voice soft, vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard before. "You won't," I replied, reaching out to touch his shoulder, my hand lingering there for a moment before dropping back to my side. Buddy looked up at me, his eyes warm and understanding, almost as if he were offering his own silent approval. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like he was giving us his blessing in that quiet, gentle way. Only a dog can. Ethan smiled, a genuine, grateful smile that made my heart feel lighter. "Thanks for everything, for not freaking out." I laughed, a soft, relieved sound. "Yeah, well, it's a little weird, but I think it's right, at least it feels that way." We sat there for a while longer, the silence between us comfortable, the tension fading into something warmer, something that felt like hope. Buddy lay beside us, his head resting on his paws, his tail wagging slowly as if he were sharing in our happiness. As the night wore on, I realized that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a promise of something new, something real. And I knew deep down that whatever happened next, we'd face it together, me, Ethan and Max. The three of us bound by something we couldn't quite name, but knew was real. That evening Ethan came over again, but this time things felt different. The air between us was heavy, thick, with unspoken words and lingering glances. Even Buddy seemed to sense it. He stayed close by, watching us with his curious eyes, as if he knew something was changing. We settled on the couch like we always did, but I noticed Ethan sat a little closer than usual, his leg brushing against mine. The touch was so small, but it sent a thrill up my spine, making my skin tingle. I tried to act normal, focusing on the TV, but my mind kept drifting, caught in the awareness of him sitting so close. Buddy jumped up, wedging himself between us, his head resting on my lap. He seemed content, his warm weight grounding me, offering a comfort that was both familiar and soothing. But when Ethan shifted, leaning over to pat Max, his hand grazed mine, lingering just a little too long. I glanced up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, something shifted between us. There was a quiet intensity in Jake's eyes, a look that I hadn't seen before, one that made my heart beat faster. He smiled, a soft, almost shy smile, and I felt my cheeks flush, caught off guard by the sudden rush of warmth. Buddy looked between us, his tail wagging slowly as if he were approving of the connection, his presence a silent reassurance that everything was okay. "Mind if I?" Jake's voice was barely a whisper as he lifted his hand, reaching out as if to test the waters. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and he placed his hand on my shoulder, his touch gentle and tentative. It was a small gesture, but it felt intimate, a wordless admission of the feelings we'd both been holding back. Buddy nudged my leg with his nose, reminding me he was still there, a steady presence. In this moment of vulnerability, I reached down, scratching behind his ears, my hand brushing against Jake's. Our fingers intertwined, a simple, natural movement that felt both comforting and thrilling, and neither of us pulled away. We sat like that for a while. Our hands linked, the warmth of his palm against mine, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. It felt right, like we were two pieces finally coming together, a connection that had been waiting to happen. Buddy seemed to understand, lying quietly beside us, his head resting on my knee as if giving us his silent approval. Without thinking, I leaned closer, my eyes drifting to Jake's lips, my heartbeat quickening. He noticed, his gaze meeting mine, and for a moment everything else faded away. The room was silent. The only sound was the soft breathing of Buddy beside us, a gentle reminder that we weren't alone, but it didn't matter in that moment. It felt like it was just the two of us. Slowly, hesitantly, Ethan leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our faces were inches apart, the warmth of his breath brushing against my skin, and I felt my heart racing, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He paused as if giving me a chance to pull away, but I couldn't, and then his lips met mine, soft and tentative, a gentle kiss that sent a shiver through me, awakening a longing I hadn't realized I'd been harboring. Our bodies swayed together, fitting perfectly as if drawn by an unseen force. It was like a spark igniting something deep within me. My hand tightened on his and I felt him respond, his grip reassuring and steady, drawing me closer. Buddy looked up, his tail thumping gently against the couch as if sharing in our happiness. The kiss deepened, slow and unhurried, filled with warmth that felt both new and familiar. Jake's hand rested on my shoulder, his fingers grazing my neck, sending electricity coursing through me. I could feel the weight of his touch, both gentle and electrifying. It was a moment I wanted to hold on to, a feeling I wanted to keep forever. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Our faces flushed, a shared understanding in our eyes. Buddy nudged us with his nose, as if reminding us of his presence, and we laughed, a soft, shared laugh that broke the tension, grounding us in the reality of the moment. Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding mine tightly. I didn't know it would feel like this, he murmured, his voice soft, filled with wonder. Me neither. I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper, but I'm glad it does. Buddy nestled closer, his warm fur brushing against my leg, and I reached down, scratching his head, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. It was like everything had fallen into place, like this was exactly where I was meant to be. Ethan smiled, a slow, genuine smile, and I felt my heart swell with a warmth that I hadn't felt before. He leaned in again, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead, a gesture that was both tender and reassuring. It was a promise, an unspoken vow that we were in this together, no matter what. We spent the rest of the evening in a comfortable silence. Our hands intertwined, Buddy nestled between us, his steady breathing, a soothing presence. It was a moment that felt both timeless and fleeting, a memory that I knew I would carry with me. A reminder of the connection we shared, a bond that had grown deeper than I could have ever imagined. As the night wore on, Ethan leaned his head against my shoulder. His arm draped around me, a comfortable weight that felt both protective and reassuring. Buddha lay beside us, his body curled against my leg, his presence grounding us in a way that words couldn't. It was a quiet, simple moment, but it held a depth that I couldn't put into words, a closeness that felt both new and familiar. We didn't need to speak, didn't need to fill the silence with words. The connection between us was enough, a shared understanding that transcended language, a bond that had grown stronger with each passing moment. Buddy sighed his warm breath against my leg, a gentle reminder that he was with us, a part of this new chapter in our lives. Ethan lifted his head, his gaze meeting mine, a soft smile on his lips. I think this is the start of something good, he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. I think so too, I replied, my heart swelling with a sense of hope, a feeling that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Buddy shifted, pressing closer to me, his head resting on my lap, a silent affirmation of the bond. We shared a reminder that he was with us, a part of this journey. And as I looked at Ethan, his hand still holding mine, I knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter that we would face together with Max by our side. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's warmth, the weight of Max's presence grounding us in the moment. It was a quiet, peaceful moment, a feeling that I knew I would carry with me, a memory that would stay with me. A reminder of the night when everything changed, and as we sat there, the three of us, I knew that we were bound together, a connection that went beyond words, a bond that would carry us through whatever lay ahead. The days after that night felt surreal. I'd look at Ethan and it was as if I were seeing him for the first time. There was a new depth to everything between us, a warmth that hadn't been there before. 2, 3, 15, even the simplest things felt different now, like they held a deeper meaning, a kind of shared understanding that went beyond words. And Buddy was always there, a quiet but constant reminder of how this all began. It was a late Saturday afternoon when Ethan called, his voice light and playful. Buddy and I are outside, care to join us? I laughed, glancing at Max, who was already by the door, tail wagging as if he'd been listening. And you two are impatient, I teased, grabbing my coat and heading out to meet him. Ethan was waiting on the front steps, his face breaking into a smile as soon as he saw me. Buddy bounded over to him, running circles around us like he was trying to capture the joy that seemed to linger in the air. Whenever the three of us were together, we decided to take Buddy to the park where we could just relax, letting him roam while we enjoyed the fresh air. As we walked, our hands brushed together, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness we now shared. It was strange how natural it felt, as if we'd been holding hands all along. The park was quiet. A few families scattered here and there, but mostly empty. Butter ran ahead, his tail wagging as he sniffed around, content to explore his favorite spots. Ethanhad and I found a quiet corner beneath a large oak tree where we could sit and watch Buddy without interruptions. He stretched out beside me, our shoulders touching, and the familiar comfort of his presence settled over me. Buddy trotted back, lying down with his head on my lap, his eyes drifting closed as I scratched behind his ears. Ethan watched us, a soft smile on his face, and I felt a wave of contentment wash over me, as if everything was exactly as it should be. "Remember when we used to come here after school?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with nostalgia. "Yeah," I replied, smiling at the memory. "Buddy was just a puppy. Then he used to trip over his own paws, trying to keep up with us." Ethan chuckled, reaching over to pat Max's head. "He's grown a lot since then, but he's still our Max." I looked down at Max, feeling a rush of affection for the dog who had been with us through everything. He'd seen us at our best and our worst. A loyal friend who never judged, never asked for more than a scratch behind the ears and a warm place to sleep. Ethan took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was such a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. We sat there in comfortable silence, just watching the world go by, content to be in each other's company. After a while, Buddy lifted his head. His ears perked as he looked at us, almost as if he sensed the shift in our relationship. He nudged my leg with his nose, and I reached down to pet him, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this moment, for the bond we shared with both Ethan and Max. Ethan leaned closer, his head resting on my shoulder, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling that was both new and familiar. Buddy lay beside us, his steady breathing, a comforting rhythm grounding us in the moment. I knew that this was more than just a friendship. Now it was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time, waiting for the right moment to come to life. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling of contentment that I hadn't known was possible. Ethan turned to me, his gaze soft, and I knew he felt it too. There was no need for words. Everything we wanted to say was already understood. Buddy let out a contented sigh, his head resting on my knee, his eyes half closed as he basked in the warmth of the fading sunlight. It was a simple moment, but it held a depth that I couldn't put into words, a reminder of how far we'd come, of the journey we'd shared with Buddy by our side. Ethan shifted, his fingers brushing against mine, a gentle reminder of the bond we now shared. I looked at him, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, and he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek, a gesture that was both tender and reassuring. "We'll always have this," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Yeah," I replied, my heart swelling with a warmth that I hadn't known was possible. "We will." Buddy let out a soft bark as if agreeing with us, and we both laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet park. It was a simple moment, a memory that I knew I would carry with me, a reminder of the love we shared, a bond that went beyond friendship, beyond words. As the stars began to appear in the sky, we walked back home. Buddy trotting beside us, his tail wagging with each step. With Buddy at our side, a continuous presence, and a reminder of the love and friendship that had led us this far, it was a fresh start and a trip we would embark on together.